Hello and welcome to another edition of The Rebel Road. We are seeing a lot of changes going on in the world right now, and many times we often question what can we do out there to make a difference. And most of the times it has nothing to do with what's going on out there. The Pope just recently gave a speech, and he talked about how the ecological system and many of the systems that are taking place right now, they are part of what was a spiritual cause, a spiritual sin, or something that went wrong with how things were handled. And we need to go deeper in how we look at things. If we look at the earth, if we look at economics, if we look at anything going on in the world, it ultimately boils down to relationships. And so today I wanted to bring you a guest, a dear friend, a mentor, a brilliant coach, an amazing breathwork teacher and facilitator, and one of the individuals that has truly impacted my life, Kizer. And let you speak to him because he is a relationship expert. And any topic that can come up around relationships, he has key answers that will absolutely blow your mind. And right now, where we need to go is blowing that mind and getting into our hearts. And so Kizer is definitely a person to speak to in regard to that. Buckle your seatbelts and get ready for a wild ride and a very deep conversation that may take you up and down and all around, but hopefully back inside yourself. Kizer's website is centerfораwareness.com. I hope you do look him up. After this, you are in for quite a treat if you get to know him, and you will definitely get to know him here. So welcome, Ken. It's so nice to have you on.
Wonderful to be here.
The relationship topic is a really, really deep one. It is one of those pits we could dive into and probably never go out of because it is so vast and so deep. And as we look at the world and everything that is happening outside of it, it is really about relationship. It's about our relationship to the world, our relationship to each other, and ultimately our relationship to ourselves. Can you first talk about how you view relationships as a pathway, perhaps, to really creating change on the planet and especially creating change in our own lives?
Well, relationships are a projection of our inner value systems. What we experience in relationship with people or things is based on our expectations. So relationships are a great way to get a peek of how we really view ourselves and the world. So that can apply across the board, whatever the venue or the topic or the experience or the situation is based on what we believe about ourselves. And sometimes people feel like a victim of their environment.
Yeah, that's a big word right there, the victim of their environment, because oftentimes when we're in a relationship and someone has quote unquote done us wrong or created a situation where we're feeling like that victim, what's really going on there? How do we who's really creating that victim? Is it the other person, or is it our perception and belief around what's just taken place?
Well, one of those mind-blowing thoughts is the idea that we very carefully train people how to treat us in relationships. Now, that's a function of our childhood years where we begin to draw conclusions about how life works based on the people who are raising us. The problem is a lot of that stuff goes unconscious, and we forget that we expect that love comes wrapped in the idea of abandonment or emotional boundary invasion or that sort of thing. And a real quick way to find out what we really believe about life is to just look at the quality of our relationships.
And when we look at these relationships, I know in my own life, my greatest teachers have been my most dysfunctional relationships. Those are the ones that have caused me to grow in the grandest of ways, and oftentimes the ones that we want to fight and leave, but are really necessary to stay in and work through. We are in a country where there is the highest divorce rate in the country, or there is an easy way to sometimes think we can just turn our back and walk away from a relationship. Do you think that it is better to really stay the course to a certain extent to really work on the self, or do you think that a person can leave a relationship and work on themselves? Which is the better path to really dive into what we're believing about ourselves?
Well, that's a really common question, a really difficult one to answer, but it's not the appropriate question. The question is, did you get the lesson? Because if you did, it's okay to let that relationship go. Now, sometimes people leave and it's a rejection of the experience. That is guaranteed to create that experience again in the succeeding relationships until we learn whatever that particular lesson is.
So, as we are moving through a relationship and it doesn't feel good anymore, then unless we're willing to really look at not the experience that's taking place, but look at what it's asking for within us, is that where you feel like people can glean that lesson?
Um, yes, and the question I ask of myself and other people, and finding myself in a situation like that, is how did I get here? And that's a profound thing to ask, and it will begin to reveal answers, because what it touches on is expectations. Our worlds are formed by our expectations, whether we're talking about career success or relationships or happiness or whatever. So that's really where we start to get to the source of it, not just the symptoms.
So, when you're talking about expectations, we go into a relationship really already looking for what we thought it was going to turn into. And
Well,
that's where the obstacle shows up, is that expectation creates kind of a house of cards that we're looking for, but then that house of cards doesn't actually, it falls because it doesn't actually happen.
well, let's go a little further with that idea. We actually have a picture in our minds of how we expect to be treated, who we expect the other person to be, that a lot of times has nothing to do with the other person. So there's a conflict that comes up between discovering that they really sort of do match our expectations, but sometimes really don't, and trying to resolve that conflict that comes up.
So, in entering into a relationship, whether it is a personal one, a career choice, a business interaction, whatever that relationship is, rather than having an expectation for the experience of relationship, where should that focus lie?
I think it starts with love. I think it's a very simple idea to begin with, is just how can we enjoy each other in the most loving way possible? And that will, the principle we work with is love brings up everything unlike itself for the purpose of healing. And what that means in practice is, as soon as people get through a honeymoon phase, and here I'm speaking about intimate relationships, although other relationships have a similar pattern. Once we get past the point of discovering what we have in common, we start discovering what we don't have in common. And that's when the power struggle comes up, and that's where we start having to handle our own, um, I would call it could be called victim consciousness, but it's the idea that people might owe us something, or we want them to please us rather than trying to find a way to not to compromise. I don't want to use the word compromise because that to me implies a certain amount of giving up power, but it's learning how to cooperate with each other. If people come together, really, regardless of the relationship, there's a purpose. There's a reason. There's a reason people come together, whether it's working, intimacy. And so for the most enjoyable experience possible, cooperation is called for to find ways to have that vision come true. And um, I mean, a lot of times people realize they really don't want to give anybody anything. They really don't want to cooperate. They really don't want. They are they find that they are very demanding. They expect to be taken care of, and on and on. So um, powerful relationships bring that unfinished business up sometimes very powerfully, not as punishment, but just as signals from the universe about uh, these are things you might want to address if you want to enjoy this experience.
So I have seen in many different relationships that of people that I have worked with and just in witnessing, and I've also even seen it in my own life. There are times, and maybe this happens in all relationships as part of our lesson to learn, but there are times it seems where we get into relationships almost in a barter situation. If you will fulfill this for me, if you will create this place for me in my life and my experience and whatever, then I unconsciously will give you the permission to behave in this manner, and vice versa. If I will do this for you, if I will fulfill this role as the woman for you, then you will unconsciously or subconsciously give me permission to behave this way. And yet then we turn around and we resent the person for the very thing that they're doing, even though that we've kind of entered into that barter situation. Can you talk a little bit about, or however you term it, the barter experience that takes place before there's actually truth that takes place or awareness that takes place in a relationship?
That's a big one. Um, Healthy relationships are a function of two healthy people coming together. When we look to others to fulfill something we feel is lacking inside of ourselves, basically we turn them into a parent and we show up as children. And that tug of war that goes on of demanding and then resenting is what we go through as children. So the challenge then is to realize that nobody can give us anything we feel that we are lacking. And that's a huge misconception in relationships. So many people go into it with this vision, this picture that this perfect person will bring those pieces I feel is lacking in me into my world, then I'll feel fulfilled. But just talking about it in those ways, it starts to sound like, well, the other person isn't being treated as an equal. They're being treated as um, something I go to the store to buy to to improve the quality of my life, and very often people will come to resent it very much um, on that level. And the other thing is these expectations, this barter thing that goes on, typically 90 or 95% of that is unspoken.
Mm-hmm.
And that really creates problems. It's like, um, read my mind, and if you don't, then I'm going to punish you. And none of it's ever verbalized. And that's rather unfair to the other person, to put it mildly.
There are a lot of situations where there are uh, very successful men and they are married to women, and women are not feeling in their power because they don't have a sense of purpose. They don't feel like they know who they are, or they're out there in the world doing anything. And yet the money's there, or the house is there, or, something seems to be being fulfilled, yet there's an emptiness that's inside for a lot of women. And I've seen this take place often. Yet I don't know that people are aware that that is part of that, whether it's manipulation or a barter or something that's taking place, rather than a person stepping into their own power and having their own independence. Can you talk about that type of relationship and what's going on there? And it can happen the other way as well. It can happen where there's a very successful so-called woman, and then the gentleman is the opposite.
Well, the couple of things come to mind. It's a form of slavery in a way, but it's also exactly the echo of childhood. This is what we experience in childhood. We are provided for, and our options are incredibly limited because at that point in time, we really don't have the resources to take care of ourselves. Um, and I don't know the experience as a woman. I know what it looks like as a man, but from a male perspective, it's possession, it's ownership, it's not partnership.
Mm.
And sometimes from the male perspective, it really is about total control, not just of her actions, but almost of her will. Um, and that's going to create some friction.
And control tends to be a part of a lot of relationships in some form or another. And if control exists in one partner, there would be an equivalent level of control in the other. It's just used in a different way. Would you think?
Well, it might go back. I mean, there are different ways that could be experienced, but certainly part of it could be a barter has been made. Um, I demand to be taken care of, and what I have to give up to make that happen is to cede control to you of my life. Now, some people do that consciously, and if it's a conscious agreement, I don't see anything necessarily wrong because those people show up with that understanding. But if it's unspoken, then that can be, for instance, one way that a person, a man or a woman, sets up that ownership situation, but then attempts to punish the other person for controlling them. And that too is an echo of childhood when we expect to be given everything, but we also expect to be in total control of our own lives. And you can't have both. You can't do both. And some people try to do that and wonder why it won't work.
Now, in those situations, it often seems that there are breakdowns in terms of sexuality within relationships. And many times, is that part of that manipulation and control factor where the sexuality almost feels as if it's part of the barter or the slavery, and then it's not the natural organic type of experience that a true whole relationship is supposed to have?
Absolutely. And sexuality can be used as a way to punish people, either by how it's performed or by withholding it. You betcha.
And then when we look at abusive relationships, because that has become such a focal point in a lot of areas, women's abuse and domestic violence, when we lead up to situations such as that, what has really taken place? Is that just the same level of control but catapulted to such an extreme that it has now outpictured into physicality? Or is that more so the individual within themselves at such a place of victimhood and anger at the self that they are allowing that experience to maintain in their life?
Um, it could be some of all of that. For the person who is doing the abusing, it's a way to punish the partner for not meeting their expectations. For the person who's being punished, it could be guilt. It could be that they grew up in a situation where love came wrapped in the experience of abuse. So there are a whole lot of different elements that could be contributing to that experience between people.
And for individuals that are wanting to step out of that place, because if there is guilt involved, that seems to be a huge factor for many people that they encounter. And oftentimes we don't even realize that we're feeling that sense of guilt. So where's the first place that people need to start looking at in their relationships to start to understand whether they're shame or in guilt or manipulation or control? How do they start to discern at what level of their awareness they're at so that they can start their own inner work?
I think one key question or one key idea is if it feels like you are responsible for the other person's happiness or upset, that's an illusion because we can't make people be a victim and we can't make people be happy. That's an internal choice each person has to make for themselves. And there are a lot of ways. See, abuse. One of the breakdowns in abuse is that emotional boundaries have been violated and repeatedly violated to the point that people don't expect to be able to be in charge of their own bodies. And excuse me, um, that boundary confusion shows up in thinking that we're responsible to make somebody happy. And that may be part of the conscious agreement people make. I want you in my world because I love being with you. You make me feel so good. That's a really common misconception because nobody can make you feel good. You have the choice to feel good or not. And it's a subtle word distinction, but on an emotional level, it's a huge difference in how things work. And it to think somebody makes you happy will is either now creating problems or is guaranteed to eventually create some serious problems in a relationship.
And one thing I also think is very important is when there's a situation of abuse or disrespect going on in a relationship, it looks like that disrespect is coming from the outside, but that disrespect of the self has to be there for that to occur.
Mm-hmm. Guilt is an emotion that demands punishment. When we feel guilt, we will enroll other people in helping us feel guilty, and we will enroll other people in helping us punish ourselves. Now, that really touches in on the idea of what being a victim means. And the truth is, it is possible to be a victim, but only of ourselves. Nobody can make that happen. Um, and sometimes people are trained to think poorly of themselves and then wonder why the world keeps jumping on their case, because there's, to some degree, probably a conscious thought, but definitely unconscious expectations that if I get involved, if I show myself, bad things are going to happen. Those expectations are really powerful. If you've ever been in an experience where you've noticed that around certain people, you're behaving in a way that you don't behave around other people, that's like being under a spell, and that's the power of expectations. We we all try to please people, and those expectations are a tremendous temptation. The thing is, it doesn't matter if they're positive or negative. And here's the idea that can really take some time to understand. In their love for us, people give us what we expect to get in relationships, whether that's to be treated nicely or not. Okay? So that takes the victim consciousness out of it. We are, in our expectations, inviting people to treat us in certain ways. However, that shows up is what we really believe about relationships and about what we deserve in those relationships.
I want to go back to something you said because I think it's very, very important. And you talked about how I show up, how we show up. Because there will be some relationships where an individual shows up in a very powerful way. They show up in their truth or their essence or their real soul beingness. And yet in other relationships, they may always feel as if they're people pleasing or they're codependent or they're the weaker person and they can't seem to overcome. So that expectation and that relationship really has more to do with how we show up in front of each and every individual as to how that relationship will then proceed. Is that what you're saying?
Part of that, yes. Part of that, though, is how strongly we hold on to our vision of ourselves and our own expectations. If people who are people pleasers will find that it's easier to feel good around people who are willing to let us feel good. It's harder to feel good around people who aren't. Okay, so that's a sort of a litmus test that people can do for themselves, just to notice if you're around what you know is somebody who is an abrasive personality, and you find yourself trying to please them, trying to tiptoe around them, and find it difficult to speak your own truth in their presence, then there's some work to do.
And why is that it gets so hard for people to express their voice? I know I was speaking to a friend this morning and she was saying, I don't understand why I can't just say this tiny little thing. It's how I feel and I can't just get it out. And so often it's something that gets stuck right here for many people and it just can't get voiced out, and yet it ripples out into the very experience that they don't want because they don't speak up. What is the block that keeps so many people from just saying what they want to say?
I would term that is bargaining. They're trying to bargain, and what they're trying to bargain about is, if I withhold my truth, please treat me nicely.
Hmm.
Okay, because we that kind of person is seeking external validation. And that's a huge trap. I mean, that's guaranteed. There's no way to fulfill it, first off. Second, it's constantly painful. It never, it never works. And it's so incredibly common in this world. And that too is an artifact of childhood. When, see, this is why that stuff is so compelling, so sometimes so difficult to work through. Because in childhood, our our very survival depends on pleasing the people who are taking care of us. And that's the feeling gets stuck in our throat, is if we don't please whoever, we may not survive. And another way to talk about that is that's really seeing the world through the eyes of that child.
Mm.
Okay, at that moment, we really are a child.
And so one thing that I've learned over the past 2 years is really the significance of how identity impacts our entire world, how it is everything. It is our perception, it is our patterns, it is our belief. And that identity is what we believed from childhood.
Mm-hmm.
It is probably the biggest mask of all. You know, we spend our lifetime shedding all these masks that we've created,
Mm-hmm.
but ultimately the largest mask of all is that identity of who I actually am, or think that I am. So is there a place that individuals can then step outside and say, I'm not these experiences that happen in childhood, or I don't want to have to go back and work through those things. Can't I just now be a different person and no longer allow myself to be dictated by what I thought were those beliefs? Or is it necessary for individuals to go back? Because many people shy away from doing that work of going back to the child.
You asked several pieces here. Let me sort through that. First, I don't think it's about getting rid of the masks, because many of those experiences, whatever we learned about love that works, we also learned the parts of love that don't work from the same people. So it's not possible just to totally reject what we learned in childhood. We have to sort out the parts that do work from the parts that don't work. Um, there's no requirement that we do any remedial work. It's fine for people to be who they are from whatever that is. The thing I know that got me to do the work, though, was that I was no longer willing to endure the pain. Okay? So if people are tired of the pain, then they need to do the work. It really is that simple. But it's not the universe punishing us if we don't. It's the internal conflict between what our heart knows is the truth versus what we've tried to pretend really works for us. And if it's painful, that's a sign that there's an internal conflict. And if people want the pain to stop, then they're probably going to need to get some support from outside first, because as another person I know says, my best thinking got me here. So it's not going to get better without some support. And really, the truth is, everything we know about life, I mean, absolutely everything we know about life, somebody taught us that. So it's not a failure to have to go back and do a little cleanup work to improve the quality of relationships. It's just a piece of work that didn't get handled when we were children.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And it is really important to find those mentors or teachers or individuals that can kind of see objectively sometimes what we can't see, because so often it's easy to get caught in the spin of one's own stuff that they can't see beyond that tornado that's surrounding them.
Truly. Absolutely.
So let's go back a little bit to the guilt, because I don't think a lot of people realize that guilt and shame are actually attached, that guilt is actually a part of what shame is, that shame is the deepest core piece that we all probably hold and have to get to, whether we're willing to face it or not. Can you talk about the relationship of guilt and shame, and whether we hit one versus the other at a certain pace?
One definition I've heard of those is shame is a public experience of guilt. Guilt is an internal experience. Okay, so they really are the same thing. There's no energetically how they affect our worlds. There really is no difference. It is all one thing, which is pretending. And as a spiritual life coach, this this piece of my work I think I find is fundamental. Guilt is the idea that we can be separate from God. Okay, everything else follows from that.
Mm.
And the experience of God or the creator of the universe, whatever term people are comfortable using, I go back to the idea of God as the experience of unconditional love. And unconditional love means that we are accepted as we are, period. That doesn't mean you have to clean up your room, doesn't mean you have to look perfect. It means that you are accepted as you are. And the reason I know that God represents unconditional love is because the existence of evil on the planet. If God did not accept everybody and everything, there would be no evil on the planet. And there is, okay? So there's room for people to exist. We don't have to worry about pleasing God. And a lot of times guilt comes from the idea that if we're not perfect, then there is something dangerously flawed about us, and that deserves punishment. Okay? So we really have to go back to those roots to get to the core of this. The way a lot of people experience it is that we set our parents up as gods when we're children, and that there are some dangerous dissimilarities because they're not perfect, and we do end up getting punished for not being perfect. Then we want to impose our experience of our parents on what we think God is. So there's a blending that starts to happen between those two different experiences, and there's some areas of where they are not at all alike. And I think that really contributes to people's confusion in dealing with guilt.
I agree with you, and I think that when they talk about the false idols, that probably that first false idol is the parent, because we rely so heavily as children on them, and then all of a sudden we make them bigger than life in our minds. And in many cases, it takes decades upon decades for individuals to really move outside of seeing the parent as that, and stop the projecting onto source, God, universe, as you have spoken. So in working through that shame, there's so much talk right now about more vulnerability, even for us to move into a deeper level of humanity, real humanity, where we are open-hearted and not guarded, and where we're not shielding the emotions that we hold inside. It requires a level of vulnerability. And can you talk about the distinction between the shame expressed and the vulnerability as truth? Because oftentimes I think the line can get blurred, and if not in a safe enough space, it can turn into a pummeling if someone is not careful. So
yes, vulnerability to me there are two different ways that can be experienced. One is the experience of childhood where we have no emotional boundaries. The other is as an adult where we do have the ability to choose situations, relationships where we open our hearts to other people. Now, related to that, I think the understanding the difference comes from dealing with guilt, starting to heal and resolve the guilt. And what I would, the universal healer, there is only one thing that heals, and it is forgiveness. Okay, that's it. For many people, that's way too big a stretch. They have no idea how to get there. So there are intermediate steps that can be taken. And the first step is to start accepting parts of self that we formerly could not accept. And that alone will sometimes drive people into the arms of support groups because it can feel just overwhelming. Because, for instance, if we grow up in a family where the idea of guilt is part of our survival and we get accepted into the family group because we're willing to experience guilt, then it feels like our survival is threatened if we decide we want to stop being guilty. Okay, so sometimes just that piece alone requires really getting support and getting help in walking through that. But the idea of acceptance presents its own challenge, because right now, for instance, the political discourse in this country is just so incredibly heated, and a lot of times it looks like for one party to get their way, they're in effect seeking the elimination of other people, and that looks like the only way to get my way. Well, okay, first off, acceptance of people with whom we disagree in no way implies that we like those people or that we accept their philosophical point of view. It just means we stop arguing about their existence. Okay? Sometimes people think acceptance means that, well, I put myself at risk. If I accept my husband, that means I have to buy into him abusing me. No, it doesn't mean that. It just means you stop pretending that you can change his behavior. You accept that this is a person who's going to be abusive, whether you're in the house or not. And it's not your job to heal him of his abuse. And a lot of times that actually provokes even more abuse to have that point of view, because it's very controlling to think we can change someone else's behavior. So I know I just walked all over the planet in explaining that, but that's a really deep part of our experience of ourselves.
So I want to go back over both of those, because when we do look in the outer world and we do look at the way, and politics is a perfect picture to look at, you know, the mud throwing, the tearing down, the way to try to put people down or defame them is just an active practice. And it's an outpicture of the way we do relationship otherwise. You can see the very same thing in relationships between women. You can see the same thing in relationships in workplaces between coworkers. So it is something that is happening on all levels of society. And how do we as a species move forward in our relationships so that we start to really change as a whole? Because we are much more animal than animals, in my opinion, at times, with the way that we treat one another. And so that lack of compassion, or that lack of acceptance, or perhaps that lack of forgiveness that exists, it seems to only show up in those moments when there is extreme crises or extreme danger that takes place, that all of a sudden brings people together for a few minute moments, and then all of a sudden everyone goes back to business as normal. So since I'm asking you to solve all the world's problems right now, how would you respond to that in terms of how do we really make a shift in our own relationships so that starts to really ripple out into the world?
I encountered a really interesting model of relationships, the stages of relationships, at one point in my own learning. And it's 5 stages, and the first 3 are the most important here. One is, of course, when we get together with people, we see everything that we have in common. Everything is great. Then we start noticing our differences. That's called power struggle. That's when the fight really starts to happen. The next stage, though, and this used to be a part of the political discourse, for instance, and it really is an act of grace to be able to do this, is learning how to agree to disagree. Okay? Certain elements in certain political parties right now are unwilling to compromise. Or let me use the word I attempted to use earlier, cooperate with each other. Governing can only happen when the parties cooperate with each other, when they learn how to disagree, agree to disagree, and they still come up with common solutions that work within their own philosophies and constituencies. It's the same in personal relationships. There are times when people are drawn to each other or find themselves in relationships, and in the act of discovering each other, begin to realize there's too big a gap to be able to hold the relationship together. Now, sometimes in, for instance, personal and especially intimate relationships, what I find is that people, because they make the love so precious, they think, and I hear these words sometimes, I'll never find love like this again.
Mm.
But what it does is it causes them to ignore the fact that the gaps may be too big to have a healthy relationship with each other. On a personal relationship, love is the easy part. Love is everywhere. There's no need to make love precious. What is precious is the ability for people to show up in a way that they know how to take care of themselves. They don't need the other person to be anything. They're willing to accept them as they are. And from that basis, when relationships start like that, they turn into truly enjoyable experiences. So the political discourse right now, I think, to echo from personal relationships, is that people are saying, if I don't get this from you, I can't survive. Okay? If I can't change your mind, if I can't overrun you, if I can't control you, then my existence is being threatened. Um, and really, that forgets the idea, that ignores the idea that this country needs everybody who's in it. We don't want to try to eliminate 50% of the population because they're the wrong political party. That's not going to work. And it, it goes on to the extreme that lately there's even more talk about states seceding from the union and that kind of craziness. Okay, these are people who are just absolutely unwilling to hear the word no, first off, cannot bear it. Second, they're unwilling to cooperate with their neighbors. And it's guaranteed to create conflict. Guaranteed. Guaranteed.
You said something earlier, and you talked about love being too special. And when you said that, it made me think, is that part of the problem? We've made love too special. We've made truth too special. Freedom is too special. All of the things that are the higher virtues that we all seek, that we all aspire to have, that we all claim or exist, we've actually made them so special that they're not within our reach because we've made everything else available. We've made the corruption. We've made the fighting, we've made the discord. That's normal, that's average, that's here. So how do we bring, first of all, is that the problem? Is it all just too special that we've made it ethereal and don't really realize what it is to be able to embody it? And if that's the case, how do we bring it back down and put it into our bodies?
Well, I think even that image is part of the problem, the way you just spoke it, because love exists all the time. There's nothing we have to do to make that happen. The action that needs to be taken is to cease denying the existence of the love. Okay, so it's to focus on clearing the blocks or clearing the ideas that make us think there's something broken and then we need to go find the love. It already exists. We're just laying something on top of it that makes it difficult and sometimes even impossible to access it.
So when many individuals look at something like ISIS or look at something like a school shooting or a political discord or any type of activity that's going on in the world today, and we say love is already existing, how do we as a species start to look at that situation to say love is existing here, and any struggle, fight, victimhood, or judgment that I hold in this particular situation is actually everything outside of that love that does exist?
Yeah. What I would say is those people are portraying themselves as victims, portraying themselves as helpless, portraying themselves as unable to get the things they need because of what other people are doing. And that's an expectation that they have set up. And here's what I know about this. If you believe something, it is too easy to find evidence to support your idea, whether that's a positive or negative idea. To confirm the idea of victimhood, all it takes is reading the news, because the news is full of victim stories. That's what news people do. I mean, uh, for many years, as long as I can remember, people have been talking. Why don't we report the good things that happen? Partly because we're addicted to drama, and victim stories are always very dramatic. And there is sometimes there is a redemption that can happen, but a lot of times for those victims, it is something external to them. So they may never get the idea that they're the ones that started to believe in themselves, and then they got support and corroboration from their environment of the belief they started to adopt. Okay? If we believe in wholeness, we'll experience wholeness. We believe that we are a victim, the world will only be too happy to confirm our belief. Okay? It's a simple idea, but it's a profound shift in how we experience ourselves to actually see ourselves as whole. And and let me say it this way: a lot of times people think they're broken, and that idea of brokenness is what feels hopeless, and we feel helpless in it. I much rather use the idea that we really are okay, but we've just forgotten. There's confusion. Okay, that makes it much more accessible to realize, oh, you mean I just missed a grade in school? Yeah, that really is the basic idea.
You know, in my experiences, especially over this past year, what I realized were a couple of different things. And that was, number one, is that not many of us really even understand what real love is, that real love is the full bandwidth and expression of dark to light, that it is all of it encompassed, and it all has purpose and meaning.
Which is part of the acceptance. I mean, that's how you get to what you're describing.
The second part that I realized is through the course of that experience that I had created every experience of my life through a mythology, a story, a fairy tale in my particular case. And when you're talking about victimhood and you're talking about the expectation and what we're externalizing, if we look back at whether it's religious story or mythology or fairy tales or anything that's taken place, do you find that our relationships even are grounded in some type of story that has been embedded in our cellular structure or in our minds, that we just keep repeating out, and it is coming out of that story or having the hero's journey that we ultimately are seeking?
Well, that's a very interesting thought. There is a story, and it is the Knights of the Round Table story.
Mm.
And it is the story of going from innocence through loss of innocence back to innocence with experience. Okay? And innocence with experience is the idea that we are okay inside. Fundamentally, we are fine. And we don't want to forget the experiences that we've been through, because the experiences teach us how to create emotional boundaries. The innocence of a newborn is a person who is completely at effect of everything in his environment, his or her environment, positive and negative. Innocence with experience is the forgiveness of guilt, but it is also remembering that we have personal boundaries and that there's no reason to be around people who are negative, who don't support the idea of personal responsibility, who aren't innocent to themselves, that sort of thing. Okay? And there's a book written about it, I think it's called She by Robert Johnson, I believe is the author, where you can read, he really breaks this whole thing down very beautifully and walks it through, that the basis of Western civilization is the poem that the story is based on.
Mm. That's powerful. That's very powerful. We talked a little bit about forgiveness, and we definitely are going to have to do a part 2 to this series to get really deeper into some of the different things. But I do want to make it back around to that point just a little bit, that it does come down to acceptance within relationships, and then ultimately it is about forgiveness and self-love for all that are in the relationship, especially the individual themselves. So in those first steps towards forgiveness, to me, that's a word that's a lot like love. I don't think a lot of people really understand what that means. I think we do it more with our minds initially than we actually do it integratively with our hearts and our bodies. Touch a little bit on forgiveness so that we can then move into that with our next episode in a deeper way, but give some sort of idea as to some deeper level of the meaning of forgiveness rather than what many people might have as a surface point of view.
I would say the first part of that comes up for me is the idea of just accepting self. Because a lot of times we want to deny parts of our personality based on the fear around childhood, that if we don't think, say, and do certain things, then our survival is threatened. And then we attempt to deny aspects of ourselves that it is impossible to deny. Okay? And we have to go through the fear that we might not survive accepting what we find. Um, this is a very emotional, excuse me, kind of experience, and sometimes it really does require guidance to get through it. Um, but once that starts to happen, once we prove that we survived and we survived and we survived, and it takes time to reinforce that. Um, the everything. Let me back up a little bit. And you talked about this briefly earlier on. Our worlds work the way that they work from a personal level based on our faith in ourselves and our ideas. That's it. It's that simple. The only reason things that ever work the way they do is because we expected them to work that way. Now, that's where the idea of, well, how did I get here that I expect those things to happen? We need to be able to really look honestly at what we carry into, what expectations we carry into every situation. Once we start accepting what we find, then the forgiveness really is anticlimactic, because it really is, the acceptance is the breathtaking part. That's the one that really sometimes people just cannot do it. Cannot accept the other political party. Cannot accept that I'm not making enough money. Um, Sometimes people resort, for instance, to various kinds of addictions as a way to hold down awareness of the truth. Okay? So it's about being willing to tell the truth that will free us from the slavery of denial. And that's what denial does. It creates slavery.
Being willing to tell the truth.
Mm-hmm.
My guest today is Ken Kizer. He is a brilliant breath worker. He is a faculty advisor and facilitator at the Intervisions Institute of Spiritual Development, founded by Iyanla Vanzant. He is an amazing coach, spiritual life coach, and has his own website is centerfораwareness.com. This is part one of a two-part series, and I invite you to join us to continue this discussion and learn more about relationships, about forgiveness, about how we can expand into the world in a different way with love, acceptance, and more forgiveness for the self, so that we are each more powerful as we move in the world and ripple that outward. Thank you, Ken, for being with me today. I look forward to deepening this discussion and continuing it in love, of love, with love, and as love. I am Simran Singh on the Rebel Road, and I will see you next time.